In the last lesson, Socrates seemed almost to have completed his task. The city had been built, the best city, happy as a whole, oriented towards the common good. The definition of justice in the soul had been discovered, each part of the soul minding its own business. All that was left was that to prove that regardless of external circumstances, it was always better to have justice rather than injustice in one's soul. And the very definition of justice had implied to Glaucon, at least, that that had already been virtually proven itself. So again, we seemed almost done. But now we find at the beginning of Book 5 that Socrates and Glaucon, as at the beginning of the book, are interrupted, and that Polemarchus and Adeimantus, as at the beginning of the book, force them to stay a while on something else, rather than letting them go. In other words, at the beginning of Book 5, the Republic symbolically starts again, right? Just as Polemarchus and Adeimantus and some others had arrested Socrates and Glaucon at the beginning of the book and forced them to stay in the Piraeus, just so Polemarchus and Adeimantus arrest him again, and force him, with the support of everyone listening, including Glaucon this time, to return to the topic of the city and speech. Socrates, you see, had not discussed at all the institution of the family, or the household. Marriage practices, child-rearing practices, had been left out. Remember, Socrates had just said, well, we'll follow the old proverb, the things of friends are in common. And this was obscure. Adeimantus had gone along with it at the time, but now he says, I was waiting, hoping that you would clarify what you meant. But now you seem to be moving on and robbing us of a whole part of the argument. So Socrates, you have to stop and go back and explain to us what you meant. How will marriage and child-rearing practices be handled in this city? Because we think that the goodness or badness of those practices are of decisive importance for the goodness or badness of the regime as a whole. So, how is it to be done, Socrates? And this request, this arrest and request, proves to unleash what Socrates calls 3 waves of argument upon them, all of which threaten to drown them in ridicule. In other words, Socrates says in effect that he had tried to hide these things before because he was afraid that they would be ridiculed, that they would seem ridiculous and unbelievable. But nonetheless, he will have to present them, these truly radical and unconventional reforms. The first one of which is the equality of the sexes among the guardian class. Male and female guardians will receive the same education and live the same way of life. The second wave is the communalization of the family. There will be no private families in this city. All men will hold all women in common. Parents will not know their children, and children will not know their parents. No exclusive marriages. So sexual equality, the communalization of the family, and finally, Socrates says, the only way that such a regime could ever come into being is if it was ruled over by philosopher kings. The third wave of reform. So, in this lesson, we're going to investigate the first 2 reforms primarily. We'll get to the introduction of the philosopher kings, but we won't talk about them because that claim proves to be very problematic. Glaucon challenges it, and that forces Socrates to explain who philosophers are, and that task takes up most of the rest of books 5 through 7. So, for now, let us discuss the equality of the sexes and the communalization of the family, beginning with the equality of the sexes in the guardian class. Socrates asserts that in their city, men and women of the guardian class will receive the same education, have the same way of life, and perform the same tasks. And this claim, I mean, we're used to claims about sexual equality today, the equality of the sexes, but this is was a highly unconventional claim in Socrates' time because ancient Greek society was highly segregated by sex. Men and women lived very different lives, and women in particular lived almost entirely domestic lives, to the point where in Athens it was actually the male who would go out and do the shopping. I mean, women stayed home and cooked and wove and such matters. Socrates' proposal would upend the way things were done among Greeks, among right-thinking Greeks, and especially because the way of life of the guardians includes a great deal of gymnastic exercise, and it was the custom among the Greeks for men to engage in most gymnastic exercise nude. So Socrates' proposal implies that within the guardian class, males and females of all ages will spend a great deal of time together exercising naked, which obviously is a strange proposal. It would seem in Socrates' terms both shameful and ridiculous to do things this way. And so before he defends his proposal, he has to attack convention a little bit. He has to argue that we shouldn't let the sense of shame and the sense of ridiculousness derail them, prevent them from following reason where it leads. And here's what he says. Well, look, Greek males exercise together naked, but it wasn't always that way. It used to be the custom that it was shameful for a man to be seen naked. But then gradually we learned that when it came to gymnastic exercise, these things were actually better done without clothes on. And so when reason had uncovered for us the better way of doing things, we left behind the old convention, and we realized that it wasn't shameful and wasn't ridiculous to do these things, because really the proper standard of what is shameful or ridiculous should be determined by what reason discovers to be best. That which is best cannot be shameful. That which is best cannot be ridiculous. So, if it turns out that it is possible for men and women to share the same way of life and the same education, and if it proves that it would be best to do things that way, then we must be willing to leave aside our conventions and scruples that might say otherwise. So, we must see whether these arrangements are possible and best, and we shouldn't worry about whether people might make fun of these proposals, because if they do, it is they, not us, who are being ridiculous. So that's his claim. And this is the most explicit point, you might say, in the Republic, where convention and reason are shown to be potentially in conflict with one another. So he has to do two things. He has to prove that it's possible and that it's best. And he starts with the question of possibility. And he frames the question of possibility in a particular way. He says, well, men and women have different natures. Is it possible? Is it according to nature for men and women to have the same way of life? And in particular, is it according to nature or contrary to nature to give women the way of life of a guardian, this warlike and austere way of life? And Socrates raises a hypothetical objection. He says, well, somebody might object to this proposal. They might say, well, look, Socrates, you're the one who said that in your city, every person should do one job, and the job they do should be the one that they are suited for by nature. One man, one art, according to nature. But of course, men and women have different natures. So wouldn't you be violating your own rule if you gave two groups who have different natures the same job? So Socrates, how would you respond here? If men and women are different by nature, how could you possibly give them the same job? And Socrates' response is to say, well, nature is an ambiguous term. Not every natural difference is relevant for determining what job somebody should do for a city. And he gives the example. He says, for example, people who are bald and people who have hair are naturally different from one another. Right? One has hair, the other one doesn't. But that's not relevant for determining, for example, who should be a carpenter. You know, if it's the case that some bald men are good at being carpenters, you shouldn't say, well, therefore, people who have hair shouldn't be allowed to be carpenters. The difference between being bald and having hair is a natural difference, but it's irrelevant. What we need to look for are the relevant natural differences between people that will determine what job they should do. And he says that these relevant natural differences are three. First, you can tell when somebody is naturally suited for a job when they learn it well and easily. Right? People who really have to struggle to learn something usually are not naturally suited for that pursuit. Second, people are naturally suited for a job or a pursuit when, after some instruction, they are able to carry on further on their own, make their own discoveries, figure things out for themselves. If they have to be led every step of the way by some other instructor, then that probably means that they're not naturally suited for the job. Right? And with these first two qualifications, you can think in terms of people who show themselves from a very young age to be like mathematical geniuses. Right? They learn math very easily, and then they start going off and discovering all sorts of stuff that ordinary people would never be able to discover because they just don't have a knack for it. Well, this is what it means to have a knack or a natural talent for something. You learn easily, and you make a great deal of progress on your own without need for help from others. And then the third factor that determines whether somebody is naturally suited for a job is obviously whether their body provides sufficient support for the pursuit. Right? Because there might be some pursuits that just put certain physical demands on people that make them unable to do those pursuits. Or, you know, to use another example, somebody who loses a hand is not going to be able to play piano as well as somebody who has both hands. Right? So your body has to be suited to the pursuit, and your soul has to be such that you learn that pursuit easily and can carry on further on your own. So that's, when we talk about assigning jobs according to nature, that's what we have in mind. And Socrates says, so what does this show in terms of men and women? Well, obviously, he says men are stronger and women are weaker, and women bear children, whereas men do not. But is that really relevant for the question whether women can be guardians or not? And Socrates says, well, no. In general, he says, the class of men are better than the class of women at everything. In other words, Socrates asserts the general superiority of men in every pursuit. But at the same time, Glaucon adds, and Socrates agrees, many individual women are better than many individual men at many things. So it's not the case that men are universally superior, that every man is better than every woman at everything. But rather, as Socrates says, the natures are kind of scattered about. And what that means is that there are some women who have an aptitude for music, who have an aptitude for gymnastic, who are spirited, who are warlike. You will find women of that sort. It's not the case that there are none of them. It's not the case that every man is superior to every woman when it comes to aptitude for music, gymnastics, spiritedness, and the like. So therefore, you will find among women those who have natures suited to the education and way of life of the guardians. And therefore, that's the job that they will be given. Now, Socrates says, look, they will be given lighter tasks because obviously they are physically weaker. You know, he suggests in some places that, for example, they might make up a large portion of the cavalry as opposed to the foot soldiers and things like that. So their bodies are not as strong, and yes, they have children, but that doesn't change the fact that in general you will find women who have the natural aptitude for the kind of education and way of life the guardians are given. So in other words, it is, sexual equality among the guardians is possible. It is not contrary to nature in the relevant sense of nature. So Socrates says, okay, we've proven that it's possible. Now let's prove that it's best. And that's not very hard for him to do. He basically says, well, look, the best city is going to be the one that has the best possible citizens. And in our city, the guardians are obviously the best possible citizens. And how do they get to be that way? By being given the education that they receive. And that means that if women are given that same education, they will be the best possible women in the city. And so the city will have not only the best possible men, but also the best possible women, and therefore will definitely be the best possible city. So, failing to educate women who are naturally apt for the guardian life is, as we might say nowadays, a waste of human resources. The city will be much better off if the women are made as excellent as possible, and that means giving them the appropriate education. Therefore, however strange, however ridiculous it might seem for men and women to have the same way of life and to exercise naked together, among other things, nonetheless, that's what reason dictates. And it turns out, in fact, Glaucon, he says, that the way that we do things now, where men and women live separate lives, that's what's really contrary to nature. If we were to act according to nature, we would give those who have the natural aptitudes the same education, regardless of their sex. So custom must give way to reason. And before moving on to the next reform, the communalization of the family, I want to say a few things about what Socrates actually just did. To begin with, he has utterly destroyed the customary understanding of the way of life of women in Greece, because the guardians have no private or domestic life, and yet the practices of women were for the most part oriented towards the household, not towards the city. But the domestic way of life has been undermined, right? We have a noble lie that's meant to make the guardians more attached to the city than to their particular family. We have the abolition of private property and private space, such that families cannot live separately from one another. And they have common living and public support, so the male of the household does not support the family, but rather the workers support everyone. So there's no cooking, there's no weaving, there's no domestic work whatsoever done by the guardians. No domestic work, no domestic place, no private property. Socrates, as one of my students once said, in effect, Socrates has just abolished women, as the Greeks understood them. There is nothing for them to do other than be guardians in the guardian class. So if you think through things, you see that the argument for the equality of the sexes within the guardian class is really kind of the final nail in the coffin of the traditional Greek household. Its elements have been removed from this city in order to make the guardians as devoted as possible to the city rather than to their family. But there's a second thing that's happened here, which is that Socrates has created a problem that will be immediately recognized. Men and women, then and now, don't customarily spend time together naked. And they do, generally, in many things, live separate lives. And the reason for these customs, oftentimes, is that this is part of regulating sexual relations between the two sexes. You segregate the sex and you have certain customs about what is appropriate and what is not in order to regulate sex. Socrates has removed those barriers entirely. And the result, as Socrates says, and Glaucon concurs, is that male and female guardians will be quite strongly driven by nature to sleep with one another. And they will seemingly, at least, have lots of opportunities to do so. But, Socrates says, we can't allow that to happen. Unregulated sexual coupling, he said, would be unholy. And we might add it would make a mess of the city, because it would make procreation happen helter-skelter. It could lead to jealousy and all sorts of things. So in other words, Socrates has removed customary restraints on human sexuality. But communities cannot survive with sexuality entirely unregulated, because the product of sexuality, children, is something of great importance to the city. So Socrates now must find a different way to regulate the sexual lives of the guardians and child rearing. Reproduction will be regulated, but not the traditional way of men and women pairing off as husbands and wives and living in a domestic household. That's impossible. So what do? Well, Socrates abolishes the private family entirely. and publicly regulates sexual intercourse among guardians, and publicly regulates the raising of children. So that's what gets us to the second reform, the communalization of the family, sometimes referred to as the communism of women and children. Because Socrates says, okay, well, how are we going to do this? Well, everything's going to be in common. So no man and no woman will be exclusively attached to one another, but all men and all women will belong to one another. No parents will know their children. No children will know who their parents are. And Socrates says, Glaucon says that whether this is possible and whether it's best is highly questionable. This is a highly questionable arrangement. And what's interesting is that Socrates defers the question of possibility. He says, let me just assume for now that what I'm about to propose is possible. And let me describe it, and then I'll explain to you why I think it's best. Then we can return to the question of whether it's possible. So he begins by describing the arrangements that he has in mind, and they're fairly simple. The rulers decide who has intercourse with whom. And you basically have an extensive, what we would call eugenics program, supported by lies. The goal is to have the best male guardians and the best female guardians mate with one another as often as possible, or as often as is needed, on the assumption that they will produce the best possible offspring. And that's what you want. And you want to make sure that the lesser among the guardians couple less often and have fewer children. And so what Socrates does is he proposes that marriages will be a kind of sacred festival where male and female guardians in the prime of life will be blessed by priests and paired off with one another and procreate. These aren't marriages for a lifetime. These are very basically temporary sexual unions determined by the rulers. Now, to a certain degree, who is paired off with whom will be determined by merit. So, for example, people who have performed exceptional services for the city will be rewarded with more intercourse. So this is another way of trying to tie private interest to the public interest. If you serve the city well, you will be able to satisfy sexual desires more often. But to a large extent, this program, as I said, will be covered over by lies because the rulers will make it look like a lottery. Everybody will draw a lot. But it's not truly a lottery because the guardians will make sure that the best male and the best female guardians always draw the winning lots. So it looks random, but it's actually regulated. Why do that? Well, because Socrates recognizes that if this were done explicitly, it might create a great deal of resentment among those guardians who are passed over. And that might undermine the unity of the city. Therefore, as much as possible, who pairs with whom should be made to look random so that there are no grounds for resentment of the rulers. So sex is a reward for public service, but it's also made to look randomly distributed. And then there is the practice of infanticide, right? Inferior children that are born will not be raised. All children who pass muster when they're born will be, he says, brought together into a big pen. They will live together in kind of a separate sort of public daycare where they will be watched over by nurses and wet nurses, not by female guardians. And female guardians who've given birth will be temporarily brought in to nurse once in a while, but they'll always be given a different child each time, so nobody will know whose child is whose and have any particular attachments. And Socrates says, well, of course incest will be forbidden, but Glaucon quite sensibly asks, how can people possibly know who their brothers and sisters and parents are? How could you prevent incest in a society where nobody knows who is whose parent or sibling? And Socrates says, oh, well, that's easy. This is what we'll do is this. When you have these festivals where people are paired off, any child that's born 10 months after that will call all guardians that were mating 10 months earlier mom and dad. And anybody who is born around the same time as them, they'll call brother or sister. So in other words, the terms father and mother, which have a natural biological meaning, will be transferred to whole cohorts of people. And the same thing with brother and sister. So these natural categories of mother, father, brother, sister become political categories applied to fellow citizens. Everybody who is born around the same time as me is my sibling. Everybody who is mating 10 months prior to that is my father or mother. Everybody who is mating 10 months prior to when my mother and father were born will be my grandparents, and et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, the entire guardian class is related to one another. That's what they think, which of course means, in fact, that there is, although incest between parents and children will be prevented thereby, there will be no attempt to prevent incest among brothers and sisters, because there really would be no way to know, which is an uncomfortable proposition. But that's what Socrates says. So parents, children, these are now political categories. The guardian class is made into one big family. And of course, in a certain way, you can say that these arrangements are certainly not according to nature, because the natural meaning of parent and child has been subverted for political reasons. So what justifies these strange arrangements? Well, Socrates argues that doing things this way, instead of having private households, would be best, because it would produce the greatest possible unity within the city. Agreement about what's good for the city. And here's how he explains it. He says, when people have the same pleasures and pains, that is, when the same things please or displease people, we might say, when people have the same interests, then they're unified with one another, when the same things cause them to rejoice or to suffer. But when people have private or different interests, this brings disunity to the city. You can think of like civil war or faction, right? So in battles during the Civil War, if the Union won, that pleased the supporters of the Union, and it displeased or it pained the supporters of the Confederacy. So you have disunity within your city. Or think of relations between the classes, the way that in our political rhetoric, Wall Street and Main Street are often opposed to one another, so that a policy that's good for Wall Street is supposedly bad for Main Street, or vice versa. This kind of idea of separate interests. Socrates is saying that when people have the same interests, your city is unified. And he says, but people come to have different or conflicting interests really when they have private property or exclusive attachments, right? So when you have children, for example, who are your children, not someone else's, then the doings and sufferings, the good or bad fortune of your child pleases or displeases you in a way that it doesn't affect other people, and in such a way that, for example, when your child is, say, in competition with somebody else's child for a job, if your child gets the job, that pleases you, but it displeases the other parents. Whereas if the other child gets the job, that will displease you, but please them. Because your kid isn't their kid, and so the fortune of your kid affects you differently from how it affects others. Or in the same way, if you have private property or something like that, or a particular business, what's good for your business might be bad for others, or vice versa. Because you have certain things that you call your own, that are exclusively your own, your happiness is tied to the fortune of those things, and in a way that potentially divides you from the interests of others. So as Socrates says, the more things you say are mine, not yours, the more potential conflicts of interest you have with one another. Whereas the more it's the case that the citizens consider the same things to belong to all of them. These things aren't mine, they are ours. The more things that citizens say ours about rather than mine, the more united they will be. Right. So, and since the greatest good for a city is to be as unified as possible in the common interest, whereas the greatest evil that a city can suffer is faction or civil war, whereby the city itself is destroyed, it follows that obviously the best city is the one that's going to be the most unified. And that's going to be the city that he has just described. where the interests of the classes are harmonized, for example. Remember, there's supposed to be a harmonious agreement between ruler and ruled over who should be in charge. The rulers will rule for the good of those they rule, and the people that they rule will recognize that. So there will be friendly relations among the members of the class hierarchy, right? In this city, Socrates says, there will be, among the ruling class, nothing private but the body. Everything else will be shared, right? It's impossible to communalize the body. When I hurt my shin, it doesn't hurt your shin, it hurts mine. You can't communalize the private pleasures and pains of your body. But everything that can be put in common is put in common in this city. No private property, no exclusive attachments, no family. Everything has been communalized. And what that means is that the guardians, as much as possible, say our own rather than my own about everything. And thus are pleased and displeased by the same things, and all are invested in the common good. Everything is shared. And Socrates says, in this context, that in fact we can now see that the guardians live the best possible life. When Adamanthus had objected earlier and said, you're making the guardians miserable. Remember, Socrates had said at first, well, I wouldn't be surprised if they were happiest just as they are, but we're not going to talk about that now. Well, now Socrates turns around and says, no, they live the best life. They are the happiest in the city because they live a life more blessed than even the life of the Olympic victors. Because these guardians win the greatest victory, the preservation of their city. And that means that they get the greatest honor, because they get honor for that greatest victory. And aside from that, they receive from their city everything that they need, and they receive support throughout their lives, and support for their children, and they receive honors and a proper burial when they die. So if the Olympic victors live a blessed life, surely these guardians live an even more blessed life, and surely it is a better life than, say, those who are in the working class. And Glaucon finds this argument acceptable, although, as we'll see in the next lesson, Socrates contradicts himself. It turns out that he doesn't think that the guardians live the best possible life. But in order to see why, he's going to have to transform, somewhat radically, Glaucon's understanding of the nature of virtue. And that will have to wait till next time. But for now, I just want to note one thing. Socrates still hasn't shown that it's possible, nor has he shown that this communalization of the family is according to nature. What he has done is attempt to overcome as much as possible what is oftentimes referred to as love of one's own. Love of those things that are yours and not others. This city has abolished to the greatest possible extent the power of love of one's own, and has transferred the allegiance of the guardians as much as possible away from their private interest and attached it to the common good. Everything possible is shared to make them as devoted as possible to the city by, in effect, giving them nothing in life other than devotion to the city and the honors that come from that. So you overcome or you suppress the love of one's own for the sake of the common good. This is very extreme, obviously. And what's interesting is that Glaucon, at this point, begins to seem positively excited about trying to figure out how it would be possible to bring this regime into being. He presses Socrates, okay, fine, how is this regime possible? How can we achieve this? Thereby showing, I think, that Glaucon is actually a rather dangerous kind of person. Not so much because he wants to be a tyrant who's exploiting others, but because he is so entranced or intoxicated or inspired by the understanding of virtue that this city embodies, that he is willing to ride roughshod over almost anything in order to bring it into being. Family gets in the way? Fine, we'll get rid of it. The relationships between men and women need to be radically transformed? Fine, we'll do it. Private property needs to be done away with? Fine, we'll do it. Lies? Fine, we'll do it. Complete molding of their character from birth until death? Fine, we'll do it. If that's the price we have to pay to achieve excellence, we'll do it. To use a somewhat anachronistic term, Glaucon is an extremist. And he's very ambitious. But his extremism and his ambition is in service of a certain view of virtue. And so that way it's not sort of criminally selfish, but it's still dangerous. I mention this because we'll see that over the course of the next 2 books, this political ambition, this extremism on Glaucon's part, will be overcome and moderated. So we'll see a kind of taming of Glaucon and his ambition. And to return to the text, Socrates has given us the first 2 waves: sexual equality and communalization of the family. But remember, in discussing the communalization of the family, he had deferred the question of how it would be possible to bring this about. And he continues to try to defer it. I won't talk about the passages where he does it. But Glaucon keeps pushing him, saying, how can we achieve this, Socrates? How can we achieve this, Socrates? And Socrates finally comes out and says it. He says, okay, well, what would we need to change about the way things that are done now in such a way as to make the city that we're talking about possible, as much as it can be possible? But it turns out that you need to have philosopher kings. That's the only way that this regime will be possible. He says at Republic 473c, unless the philosophers rule as kings, or those now called kings and chiefs genuinely and adequately philosophize, and political power and philosophy coincide in the same place, while the many natures now making their way to either apart from the other are by necessity excluded, there is no rest from ills for the cities, my dear Glaucon, nor, I think, for humankind. Nor will the regime we have now described in speech ever come forth from nature, insofar as possible, and see the light of the sun. So in other words, only if philosophy and political power coincide can the regime that you long for, Glaucon, be realized. And this is a strange claim. Glaucon treats it as outrageous. He goes on to say that most people, including the best of men, upon hearing that proposition, Socrates, would probably try to do you harm and heap ridicule on you, to suggest that philosophers ought to be in charge of such a city. So you will have to prove this, Socrates, if you're going to escape ridicule. And this forces Socrates to explain what he means, because at first blush it doesn't make sense that people who devote their lives to abstract speculation and investigation about theoretical matters are the ones who are best equipped to lead warriors in battle, govern a city, punish lawbreakers, and so forth. Political power and philosophy seem to have very little to do with one another, and Socrates must prove otherwise. And that is what he will try to do in the next lesson.